Hello, everyone. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Chris Canna to the show. Chris is the Vice President of Real Estate Development for the Corporation for Independent Living. The Corporation for Independent Living has absolutely nothing to do with independent living centers. And they are doing amazing work, though. And that's why I've invited Chris on the show. So, welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, what exactly is the Corporation for Independent Living?
We're a nonprofit real estate development company that works with service providers to develop housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, acquired brain injuries, mental health conditions, and other disabilities.
Wow. And where are you guys located?
So we were founded in Hartford, Connecticut, and that's still where our headquarters is. For the past 44 years, we've been working in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And actually, just over the past couple of years, we've started to look to expand our services to other states.
Oh, really? What states?
So we're willing to go anywhere. We're talking to people from all over the place. But the place where we're picking up the most traction at the moment is in the Mid-Atlantic region. So a little bit closer home.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about what you do. What does it mean to be like what is your role and how do you work with the service providers?
Yeah, so we were actually founded by service providers and advocacy organizations in 1979. So like the ARC of Connecticut, Easter Seals of Connecticut, UCP of Connecticut were some of our founding members. And our specific mission was to develop housing for people coming out of the state institutions that were being closed at the time. And that mostly took the form of what we in Connecticut call community residences. So single family
Like a group
homes.
home?
Yeah, so like a group home. Single family home, 3 to 5 people typically. And that's been the bulk of the housing we've done for the past 44 years and continues to be the bulk that we do today. Although we've had many adventures in real estate related to housing for people with disabilities over that time.
Are
And actually
you
do like some other
sorry.
programs related to that as well in Connecticut.
Good. I want to get into that, but tell me a little bit about this housing stock. Do you buy the homes?
Yeah, so we work with a provider to acquire, rehab, or build new a home for whatever population that they're trying to serve with the programs. So we lease homes to providers, and we work with them from the very beginning to find the appropriate location, find a house that meets their specifications, or make the modifications that meet it. We then rent the house to the provider. Typically in Connecticut and Massachusetts, it's a long-term lease, a capital lease, where the provider takes ownership of the home at the end of the lease. But we have other lease arrangements as well.
So typically the person who is living in the home or persons that are living in the home um, are paying some sort of obviously subsidized rent, maybe through a Medicaid or through a Section 8 deal.
Yeah, it's usually the provider receives a room and board reimbursement from the state. And if a individual living in the house has some other type of funding, that kind of gets all worked out, on the provider's end. But the provider is paying us a rent payment directly in most cases.
Now, you mentioned before that you're serving not just people with developmental disabilities, but you have a broader client base. Can you talk a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Yeah, so we started, focused on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but particularly in Massachusetts, through a series of lawsuits, acquired brain injury clients became, part of the same DDS infrastructure, the Department of Development Services infrastructure. So that's how we kind of got into acquired brain injury as well, because it was very similar to the intellectual and developmental disability homes. Also in Connecticut, we administer the Money Follows the Person program that does home modifications for people. That's a state program that we administer, and that has a lot of people with acquired brain injury as well.
Those two groups make up the bulk of your
Yeah, they're the
the people
vast
who are living?
majority. We also have some homes that are Department of Mental Health homes in Connecticut and Massachusetts, but those are a smaller fraction.
So you guys have been around for, you said, well over 40 years.
44 years. Yep.
44 years. How many individuals have you helped to find permanent housing?
So I was trying to calculate this. So we've done around 850 group homes in that time. And then another, few hundred or so units of other housing. Actually more than a few hundred, I guess, probably close to 500. And so we've served thousands and thousands of people over that time,
right.
especially since, some of our homes are now, our original homes are 40 plus years old, like multiple, kind of cohorts have probably moved through those homes at this point.
So the people who live in these homes, they're service providers. They're not living there with them. These folks are the service providers are coming to them on an as needed basis or on some sort of set schedule. Is that
Yeah, it's
right?
usually a shift schedule.
Right.
And
Yeah.
typically the homes we do are for people who require 24/7 care, particularly for the IDD and ABI homes.
So ABI meaning acquired brain
Acquired
injury.
brain injury. Yep.
So 24/7 care, I know that in some states this has been a real problem, providing adequate housing. In fact, I did a show on it in New York State. There's a real issue with inadequate housing for people
Yeah.
who require 24/7 care.
Yes.
Is that an issue? Has that been an issue in your state, in the states you serve in?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be an issue everywhere. Housing is such a major problem. We do a lot of work in the Metro Boston area. It's incredibly expensive to acquire and develop housing in that area compared to most of the rest of the country. So it really is a challenge. I don't know of anywhere that doesn't have some kind of waiting list, whether the state wants to admit it or not, for people who need supportive housing.
So do you work with just one service provider, or do you have a lot of clients, I guess, who are different service providers?
Over the 40 plus years, we've worked with over 120 service providers in Connecticut and Massachusetts alone. Wow. And are hoping to work with others elsewhere.
Wow. So do you think, so is the service sorry.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
That's right. I've had a lot of guests on my show who tout the benefits of inclusive housing,
Yep.
where all kinds of services are located on site. And they're building a lot more. They're not just buying houses. These folks are building buildings, multi-unit buildings. Have you had any thoughts about going that direction, or have you had any experience in that? And how does that compare to your model?
It's definitely something we're trying to figure out how we can do, particularly in Connecticut and Massachusetts. We have done multifamily housing in the past in a variety of forms, kind of as different programs have come and gone. We've done condos, we've done rental projects, we've done veterans housing, we've done supportive housing where the provider's not in the in the home, so it's scattered site apartments is the form that's taken. So we've done a little bit of everything. I think what you're specifically referring to is more the like developing 100-unit building and setting aside 20 of the units for people with disabilities.
And also services on site.
Yeah, services on
where
site,
where you have a ground level or some adjacent structure where there's all kinds of services, so that the folks who are living don't have to travel great extent or to get to work or activities.
Yeah, that very specific thing is not something we have done. We have done program facilities for providers as well. We've never integrated them into one building per se, like that. But it is very much something, that we hear a lot about from housing advocates and disability rights advocates. And it's something we're trying to, we're definitely looking at and seeing if there's a way, that we can fit into it. We are, though, very much concentrated on the community residence model because there's still a lot of demand for that. And it's something that we have a real core competency in.
The one of the recurring themes that I'm covering in this podcast is how technology is changing housing for people who need accessibility.
Yep.
Have you encountered that, and how has it impacted your world?
So we've definitely encountered it. Starting, I think it was about 20 years ago, CIL did a pilot in Connecticut for assistive technology.
Really?
Yes,
20 years ago. Wow.
And if you saw that technology today, I mean, it's laughable.
Yeah.
But it required a lot of hard wiring throughout the house, complicated switches and control panels with buttons, like physical buttons.
Yeah.
So to see it today, where with smartphones and tablets and wireless technology and just improved battery life, that it really has become a lot easier to put tech into someone's home. And that's been a great development that's made it a lot more possible. So we'll work with providers at the front end to identify what kind of infrastructure the house needs to support whatever technology they're using. But fortunately, it's become so much easier to put it into really any home that it's really opened up new possibilities for people.
Yeah. Just to clarify, do you buy lots and build housing on them, or do you typically buy resale and housing and remodel it?
It depends kind of what the needs are for the providers. So like historically, it's been mostly rehabs that we've done significant improvements to, but more so over the past 5 years, it's new construction where we're buying lots and building custom homes.
Have you guys encountered any NIMBYism about your projects, and
Yeah.
what do you do about that?
So we're very fortunate in Connecticut and Massachusetts that there's state laws that basically say anywhere a group home's allowed, or anywhere a single family home is allowed, rather, a group home can go. In Connecticut, it's up to 6 individuals. In Massachusetts, it's up to 5. So we do encounter NIMBYism. Fortunately, there's not much the municipality can do except maybe delay a little bit. So that's really important. And as we're looking in other states, like that's one of the first things we're trying to understand the lay of the land when we get to a new state is what kind of entitlement process is there, because that changes what development can happen. That's one of the things when we've looked at New York, one of the stumbling blocks is that they have laws that are meant to do the similar thing, but don't do it in a very straightforward way.
Yeah.
So that creates challenges there.
Are you familiar with the work in New Jersey that the United Way is doing?
I've seen presentations that's Bergen County, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
Yes. Oh, and I
yeah.
listened, you did a podcast with them too. Yeah, I listened to
Yeah,
it.
he was amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
the fellow's name, if anyone is who's listening, Tom Toronto.
Yep.
Uh, I interviewed him at Bergen County in I think it's northern part of New Jersey, and
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing there, the development that they're doing is really fascinating too. And
Yeah.
it's amazing what a patchwork quilt it is, though, Chris, around the
Yes.
country.
Yes.
Like you're in 2 states, he's in New Jersey. I've seen people in other states that and everywhere in the country, and different states the bureaucracy makes it harder, makes it easier.
Yeah.
Given the history of your organization, have you ever had guys thought about a national approach to your housing development?
I mean, to a certain extent, that's what we're pursuing now. We've been talking to people everywhere from California to Florida to Pennsylvania to Rhode Island, right next door. And you really do see the variation from state to state. It's not just the local land use controls, but also
Oh,
how is Medicaid administered in each state.
yes, yes.
So there are projects that are possible in Massachusetts that would be impossible in other states,
Yeah.
just because of the way the state funds the homes. So that's one of the things we're trying to figure out as soon as we're talking to someone in a state is how does your reimbursement structure here actually work? Where is the cash flow actually coming from? Because that determines, what's possible.
There has been some pretty dramatic changes in Medicaid over the years, and one that I'm following that I'm very interested in is the um, uh, changes I'm seeing in some states, including my own, California, which will allow Medicaid money to be used towards housing directly, not towards a medical thing.
Yeah.
Helping tenants, helping people to find housing, helping people to pay a security deposit, helping people to modify their homes through Medicaid.
Yes.
Have you observed any of that? Are you able to tap into any of that?
We've definitely been observing it. I haven't seen the kind of direct impact yet, but it is, quite early on where here's a project that wasn't possible 3 years ago or something, but is now possible because of, the way Medicaid's being administered in a particular state.
Do you have a sense of how much of the quote unquote market for this type of housing your agency develops versus others in the states that you serve?
In Connecticut and Massachusetts, we're probably the two biggest, or the biggest in each state historically. But there are lots of local smaller developers or home builders and stuff that work with service providers or service providers that can do homes on their own. So I'd say we've probably done about 10% of the quote unquote group homes in Massachusetts.
Pretty big percentage.
Yeah.
Does that give you some leverage that you can use politically to further your efforts?
I mean, we definitely value the relationships we have with provider organizations and, with state officials. We're often working directly with, the DDS, the Department of Development Services in each state. And in fact, in Massachusetts, one of our biggest clients is the state itself, who owns and operates some homes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not considered institutional, even though the state owns and operates the homes.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I guess.
I know
I could
that.
say they're very similar to the private provider homes.
Yeah. I mean, when we think about institutions, we think about big warehouse, hospitals with, yeah. So, can you share with me and my listeners something that you guys are especially proud of that you've done in the last, say, 10 years or so, that's making a difference, that's pushing the needle on the issue of accessible housing?
I think the project that comes to mind for me is one we did for an agency in the Springfield, Massachusetts area, where it was a complicated project where they took over 2 state-run group homes that each had 8 individuals living in the homes, and some were sharing rooms, and the homes were in quite rough shape, and because it was a state facility and state-owned land, it was a very, very complicated, long acquisition and development process. But last year we finished construction on 3 brand new homes on the property that replaced those 2 homes, so that people were able to have their own bedrooms, live in modern, like, spacious facilities, and it was just a great project that really made a difference in the lives of the people who were living there.
Right. Right. And that's why we do this, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's why we care about this. Do you get to meet any of the ultimate tenants of your units?
Yes. It's not as often as I would like, quite frankly.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when I find myself at the homes, people are out at their day programs or visiting their families. So a lot of times when I visit a house, it's empty. But yeah, that's always the most rewarding part, is when we get to meet with like the actual people who are living there, because that is the reason we do it. And one thing we do an annual report every year, and we highlight, a different project each time that really
Mhm.
focuses on the people living there. And I can share a link with you.
Yeah,
Um,
please. We'll
and
put
so
it
it,
in my show note. We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
yeah, it's and those stories are always great. There was one of my favorites is a woman named Judy who moved into an acquired brain injury home that we did for the Arc of Greater Plymouth and in the Plymouth area in Massachusetts. And we set up this photo essay, this photo shoot to go see her, take photos for the annual report. And she was like, all dressed up for it. And she was holding a picture of her from when she was a person in her early 20s, I would guess, when she worked at the Playboy Club in Boston. Look, was just so proud to show us this stuff. And so you just see like the stories, like you never know
Yeah.
kind of like where people are coming from, where they got here. And it's always great to
Yeah.
see how she moved out of a nursing home into this beautiful brand new house. And it's such a great story.
Yeah. How did you get involved in this work? You've been doing this for 8 years,
Yeah,
I understand.
I've been at CIL for 8 years. I've always had a strong interest in real estate development. I went to University of Michigan, got a degree in urban planning with a concentration on real estate development. I'm from Connecticut, so when I moved back to Connecticut. CIL was one of the groups that I talked to because they had such a good reputation as a developer in the state. And one thing, eventually, through those discussions with them, they had an opening and came to work for them.
Wow. And what do you think has been the most rewarding part of your last 8 years working for them?
It is those homes like the one I
You
just
know,
described, where you can
finishing an
take
image.
when you can, that same kind of theme comes up over and over where people are in a living situation, whether it's a nursing home or an inaccessible house. Um, and it's really affecting their quality of life and the ability for them to receive services. And we can move them into a brand new home that's fully accessible or designed to meet their needs. Like, it's a really rewarding experience.
Yeah. What do you think are the challenges that we face, well, that you face as a corporation, as an agency,
Yeah.
and that the industry, quote unquote, faces in this next decade around providing adequate, accessible, safe housing?
I think the number one thing is just staffing for services. Uh,
Staffing.
yeah,
It comes up
it's
over and
always
over and over
staffing.
again.
It's all staffing.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter what setting people are receiving or getting services in, whether it's residential, day programs, um, workforce. Um, if you can't find the staff to provide the services, it really limits your options. And so, we hear all the time from providers who would love to be opening new programs, doing this or that type of housing, opening new group homes, doing the apartment buildings you were talking about, but they can't find the staff. So for the programs they have. So to the idea of doing this kind of other next thing is very difficult. So that's definitely the number one, the kind of bottleneck in the industry at the moment. The second thing would depending on where you are, is the cost of housing. You're in the Bay Area,
Huh.
tremendously
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, Metro Boston, very expensive. So there are these parts of the country where, anyone that's on a low income, like so many of the people we serve are, is going to have a very difficult time finding, safe, affordable, accessible housing. And, um, there needs to be some structural changes, to make that possible.
Yeah. Yeah, those seem to be the two big issues that come up over and over again. I done some stories on this podcast about remote support services,
Yep.
where the staffing problem is being mitigated a little bit by
Yeah.
the use of technology.
Yes.
Have you seen that in any of the homes that you've developed where the service providers are doing that?
None of the homes that we've developed, because we're usually people that need 24/7 services.
Right, right. You
However,
mentioned
I
that.
do know providers we work with in other settings have done interesting things along those lines. Like, one provider, rents a couple apartments across the hall from each other at this one location and uses remote monitoring so that one staff member moves from apartment to apartment, but can still like see into the other apartment to see if the person needs help. So I'm starting to see things like that. And I know in some states it's much more prevalent than others. I think, in Ohio in particular, like they've been really pushing those initiatives, and it's going to be really interesting to see how they work out.
Yeah, I know that they also are focused on it in Tennessee.
Yeah.
For the podcast, I did an interview with someone from the state of Tennessee. They have a whole department for that, for
Yes.
helping to support technology and services for accessible housing around that. So it is interesting, but as to whether that's really going to make a difference in the staffing thing, isn't clear.
Yeah.
That it's really, I don't know how big a deal it's going to be, but it's certainly there are issues of privacy and independent living
Yeah.
and self-sufficiency that are worthy, right?
Yeah. And it goes with kind of another challenge to balance, which is giving people um, um, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. So you'll have to edit this one out.
That's fine.
The kind of issue of balancing like over concentration versus I guess efficiency for staffing. So, in a lot of places, like in Connecticut, you're not allowed to have two homes within 1,000 feet of each other as the crow flies. And that's meant to make sure there's not an over concentration of people with disabilities and kind of like getting back towards this reinstitutionalization. But that causes difficulties for staffing because you're making it inefficient for staff to move between homes and for service providers to cover areas. So remote supports kind of gets around that. But it's related to remote supports because there needs to be a certain proximity to make that work. If everybody receiving remote supports lives an hour away from each other, it's still not not going to work. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's been playing out in various states, kind of these very well-intentioned regulations, how they interact with each other and influence what type of housing is actually possible and what type of technology will actually work.
Do you think it's possible to say, with your experience and having had some exposure to multiple states, is there a state whose infrastructure has been better and more supportive of accessible housing than is there a state that's sort of leading the way? Not just in terms of remote services, but in terms of accessible housing and providing housing for people with disabilities and their families, whether they be intellectual disabilities or not. Do you think there is a state whose structure, not just government structure, but the whole way everything works together, that is kind of a beacon or a role model that we could look to?
Yeah, I think Massachusetts is a pretty good one. For what I hear from families, is that just the level of services available in Massachusetts are, hard to beat elsewhere. I'm by no means an expert on, all the states. I would say that the area where Massachusetts kind of falls down is in housing affordability that, that makes it very difficult for people to, stay in the communities they've grown up with or to, move into certain other communities. So that's a bit of a mixed bag, but in terms of like funding services, Massachusetts has a pretty solid reputation. But from a housing perspective, it's hard to say because it is those kind of factors. What services are actually provided? If Massachusetts funds services to a pretty high level, but the housing is very expensive. Whereas another state might have very, very affordable housing, but doesn't fund very much in the way of services. So
Yeah. I hear you. it's really interesting because I don't think you can have one without the other for many
Yeah.
communities. It's so important, right?
Yeah. I mean,
So
housing is such a huge part of, living a fulfilling, healthy, happy life that
yeah,
it's
absolutely.
hard to ignore.
Yeah. And there's the whole issue of integration of communities, which I have talked about on other podcast episodes too, and we don't really have any more time to get into that. But I did want to give you a chance. Is there, if people want to learn more about what your agency is doing and about the successes you've had in the states you serve, how can people get a hold of you?
So the best thing to do is visit our website, cil.org. We have a Let's Chat function on there that will, you fill that out and it sends an email right to me, and
Awesome.
I'll reach right back out to you.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to speak with me today, Chris. It's been really interesting. Thank you so much for being on my show.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.